2 years ago, I reported on a study suggesting that football might be too dangerous for kids due to the large number of head injuries like concussions that were being visited on people whose brains are still developing, leading to later in life complications. Since that time, loads more data has come out suggesting that football is not just dangerous to kids, but to adults as well. The most recent study was performed by a neuropathologist at Boston University, my alma mater, in which she examined the brains of 111 deceased NFL players and found that of those, 110 had chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, which is a degenerative brain disease that can lead to mood disorders, behavioral issues, and really serious problems like dementia. It can only be diagnosed after death by examining the brain. The brains in the study ranged from 23 years old up to 80 years old, and it included people who played in every different position on the field, including punters, who you don't expect to take that many hits, and running backs, who you expect to be hit all the time. It actually turns out that many of the brains with problems were those of linemen who hit their heads on pretty much every play, not to the point of sustaining a concussion, but just little knocks here and there, or what they would consider little, but which the average person would consider a really severe punch to the head. This adds support to the hypothesis that CTE can arise not just from repeated concussions, but from repeated small hits to the head. Dr. Anne McKee, the researcher who conducted this study, points out that there's a serious selection bias at work in her research. She couldn't just examine the brains of every NFL player who has ever played. The brains had to be donated by the family after death, and family members are more likely to donate their loved one's brain to a study like this if they suspect that the deceased had an issue like CTE and they wanted to know for sure or help prevent other people from experiencing the same problems. But still, 110 out of 111 is a huge number that indicates a really serious problem here, regardless of what the actual incidence rate ends up being. And meanwhile, the NFL team owners and other executives still deny that this is even a problem. In fact, immediately after this study came to light, the NFL pulled millions of dollars of funding from the National Institutes of Health. Originally, the organization pledged $30 million to support studies exactly like this one that might help identify risks to players, presumably in an attempt to mitigate them. How thoughtful and generous, right? Only it turns out a congressional investigation found that the NFL was actually using that money to try to warp results that would make it look like football isn't actually dangerous at all. Pulling funding from any potential critics, basically buying their way out of trouble. That's the problem with private industry funding important research like this. They pretty much always have a serious conflict of interest. Unfortunately, the way the U.S. government is looking these days, we don't have much of an alternative as funding is getting pulled from actual science in order to fund less scientific endeavors like transparent walls and trips to Florida golf courses and such. Regardless of their past attempts to hide the evidence, the NFL is basically like the cigarette industry, the tobacco industry, in that you can't run from overwhelming truth. Things are only going to continue to come to light, making things worse for them from here on out. At some point, they're going to have to face the music. They'll end up paying for the healthcare, the general quality of life for players, lawsuits from families, and hopefully, eventually, the NFL will realize that it's going to be a lot cheaper and more humanitarian to change their safety equipment, improve their safety equipment, and maybe even change the rules of the game for things to be safer.